2 weeks from now, Judith will preach, and she'll preach on another of Mark Miller's songs entitled, I Choose Love. Mark's friend, Lindy Thompson, wrote the lyrics to that song. Mark did the music. And Lindy wrote the lyrics in the aftermath of the brutal killing of 9 members at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, several years ago. After Dylan Roof, a later discovered white supremacist and neo-Nazi, was invited into the Bible study at Mother Emmanuel Church, whereupon he pulled out his gun from his knapsack and killed those 9 members. The song was inspired by the arraignment of Dylan Roof in court, where members of Mother Emmanuel showed up and told Dylan Roof, we forgive you. They chose love. Now, maybe it's because they're durable saints. Maybe it's because they know what it is to feel oppressed as a historically black church in the South, but they're more durable than I would have been. Today's psalm, Psalm 137, speaks to the feelings that I think most of us would have before we get to the place of choosing love. Psalm 137 is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. One, it's the only one of 150 psalms that we can locate in history by location and time. The rest of them we can't. Psalm 137 takes place in Babylon, which we now know as Iraq and part of Syria, after the Babylonians have sacked Jerusalem, the home, the earthly home of God, it was believed. God living in the temple, impregnable, and yet the temple is burned down. The city sacked. And historically, 14,000 to 18,000 Israelites deported, marched 500 miles, where they would be in exile for 2 generations, nearly 50 years. The psalm arises by maybe a Levitic priest, another priestly singer, but he writes his psalm honestly as a prayer to God. Alongside Babylon's streams, there we sat down, crying because we remembered Zion, Jerusalem. We hung our lyres up in the trees there because that's where our captors asked us to sing. Our tormentors requested songs of joy. Sing a song about Zion, they said. But how could we possibly sing the Lord's song on foreign soil? Jerusalem, if I forget you, let my strong hand wither. That would be the hand that plays the lyre. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I don't remember you, if I don't make Jerusalem my greatest joy. Lord, remember what the Edomites did on Jerusalem's dark day. Rip it down, all the way to its foundations, they yelled. Daughter Babylon, you destroyer, a blessing on the one who pays you back the very deed you did to us. A blessing on the one who seizes your children and smashes them against the rock. That is painful to hear. It's hard to hear a pastor preach about this. And yet it's the Bible. And if we believe that the Bible is God's inspired word, and even this difficult word has something to say to us. You've heard me say before that I think that one of the advantages of prayer journaling is that you can write in that only the things that God gets to see and hear. I've got dozens of prayer journals over my life. My wife does not get to read page one, and it's a good thing. Because there are feelings of frustration and anger and indignation at God and the situation around me that you don't want to hear from your pastor. But I'm human. And I need a place to go with those frustrations and indignities and anger like every one of you. And so it goes in my prayer journal. And that's a conversation, a closed conversation between God and me. The psalmist gives us honesty. And this is the second great attribute of Psalm 137. It allows for our grief and our anger and our pain to be spoken and to be lifted up as a prayer to God, who receives that in some distant way, like we receive the frustration and anger and words and tears of our kids when they act out of pain, anger, and frustration. Psalm 137 tells us that our grief, our anger, our outrage is inevitable and inseparable. We don't get to isolate it over here as something that's not really part of who I am and who I am as a Christian. We don't have that luxury. No, it says it's what it means to be human. And that God receives all that we are as human because God created us to be fully human. So God understands that. It also says that when we are places of victimization, when there are those times in our life of total injustice and cruelty, that didn't just happen to the ancients, but has happened in century after century to the modern day, that it's all right for us to be honest about those feelings. Psychologists will tell you that your feelings are morally neutral. To have the feelings is completely natural. We ought not to be afraid of them. We ought not to back away from them. It's what we do with the feelings that becomes morally liable. The psalmist lifts his feelings to God as a prayer and then lets them go. And there's something incredibly redemptive about that, because we all have had thoughts and feelings that we would not share with anyone. And yet, to give them up to God is to allow God to take them and to let them go, so that we might be freed from the burden and freed to be the best version of ourselves that God has created us to be, but which is hard when we feel victimized, when we see the pain and cruelty done to others who we care for greatly. The writer doesn't leave it there. He leaves it in God's hands, and there is redemption in that. It's what gives the prophet Isaiah the room as a prophet during the exile to be able to say to Israel, who has confessed her thoughts and her feelings to God, to say, that's not the end of the story. You will be a light to the nations. You, out of exile, will lead the people to salvation. Your hate will be replaced by hope. And this is the great word that 137 gives us, is that by giving our frustrations to God, God is able to take those feelings and those thoughts and shape them, bend them from vengeance to hope and salvation and even compassion. When starting out, that's the last thing that we want to have. For those who have done us wrong, for those who have done others wrong, who we love. But it's what God does when we give ourselves and all that we think and all that we feel to God. Martin Luther King Jr. was able to say, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice when people who seek justice give that up to God, even and especially in the midst of crying out in pain How long? How long must we endure this? Elie Wiesel, many of you have heard of, noted author, and a primary witness of a faith journey beyond victimization and beyond cruelty with a capital C to a place of compassion, because Elie Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor. If you've not been to the Dallas Holocaust Museum, put it on your Lenten plan of things to do and take your children. Elie Wiesel surviving the Holocaust, which double-digit numbers of Americans today as a percentage do not believe actually happened. But Elie Wiesel would say otherwise. 6 million Jews packed into cattle cars on rails taken to ovens and gas chambers all across Poland and Germany. He was a survivor. Has the engraved number of him as an inmate tattooed, not by choice. And he would say that it is important and vital that we be honest about those feelings. He says, I have no tolerance for the silence of memories, but I have all kinds of tolerance for a memory of silence. And what he means by that is when you speak of the unutterable horrors of the Holocaust then, and the Holocausts that have happened every decade since then, in unutterable horror, there is silence. It's unspeakable. But to be silent in our memories is to pretend it did not happen and to open the doors wide for it to happen again. That we must remember, Elie Wiesel would say. We must never forget, lest evil have its way again, and that evil and cruelty become commonplace and acceptable. No, Elie Wiesel would say, we must remember, and we must carry our prayers to God with all of our feelings and not just the polite ones. We must give them to God so that God can redeem them and enable us to reach a point finally on the journey where we can have compassion again, even for those perpetrators, like the members of Emmanuel AME Church did for Dylan Roof. Wiesel would say, and it wasn't immediate, it was a journey. He would say, when I see a child, any child, I have tears in my eyes, especially my own, especially Jewish children, but any children. We Holocaust survivors want to caress our children 24 hours a day. We want to shelter them, to show them nothing but joy and beauty, and yet we want them to know, to remember. When I speak to life, I mean children. To me, nothing is more sacred, nothing more divine than a child's life. There's two absolutes, life and death. I choose life. For survivors of victimization, ancient and modern, to express our anger in healthy ways to God, to confess that so God can take that and shape that, to choose that route in the midst of our how longs, is to choose to live, and to live with the God who stands with us and ready to receive us at the right time. But we've got to be honest about what we're thinking and feeling first, for God to be able to do that redemptive work. You were handed a card, I hope, that it's in your bulletin. And it asks the large question for today, how long? And it shows a highway that goes a long way toward the horizon, which we cannot finally see because the horizon is ever before us as we go down that road. And like the psalmist, And like you do, if you have a prayer journal, I want to invite you in this wilderness time of the year that we call Lent to be bold when no one else is looking, to write down, and we've got places on the back side, to write down where it is in your life that you find yourself crying out, how long? What is that situation? For whom are you hurting? Where is the cruelty and the folks who are being devastated by the cruelty? Who is that God has given you on your heart and in your mind? I invite us to write these down and then to hide it away because it's nobody else's to see unless you want to share it. But it's for God to see. And it's for us to ponder prayerfully the fact that God is working on our how longs. And that God is working on us with our anger, our frustration, even our desire for vengeance, to bend that from hatred toward hope, toward a salvation of compassion. We've listed a few biblical reminders to add to your prayer time as we sit along the streams of Babylon, wondering how long, when we feel like singing is the last thing we want to do. This is Lent. It enables us to wallow a little bit in that which touches us deeply, knowing that God is always in the depths and ready to rescue. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.